Joe Burrow made waves after Monday Night Football, expressing his confidence in the team's ability and his ability to do what it takes to keep Tee Higgins with the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's dive into it.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We together are Locked On Bengals on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. Welcome back to the Everydayer. Shout out to those of you who make us your first listen every day, and welcome into the new listeners who are curious about what's going on with Tee Higgins' future with the Cincinnati Bengals, for example. Or maybe you just want to know where the Bengals are picking if the season were to end today, because I made that promise after the postgame show yesterday that we will provide that update later in this episode today. Today, we're brought to you by FanDuel, where you can get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Check it all out at FanDuel.com to get started. And James, we touched on this last night, of course, the Joe Burrow confidence and the retention of Tee Higgins. Jamar Chase's comments around it as well. Tee Higgins asked about it in the locker room as well. But this is too big of a story to only talk about at the end of a post-game show where we're focused mostly on the game. Let's get back to that topic here today.
Yeah, let's get back to it, because if it's tea time, and I'm not a tea drinker, right? The TEE time, if it's tea time, well, that's a huge offseason weakness that remains a strength. If the Bengals somehow keep Tee Higgins with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, well, then there's reason to believe that this offense is going to be really, 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 really good. And you can focus on the trenches still, and you don't have to think as much about the weapons. And there's a ripple effect that it impacts the entire team, the entire roster, their entire offseason. So it would be huge. But like I said yesterday on our post-game show at the end, it's like the door felt locked with like 8 double bolts, and it was welded shut, and no one was breaking through that. And the only person that has the staff or the sword or the dagger or the sword of power, or whatever you want to say, that can pick up that sword of power and break down this door, I think is Joe Burrow. I don't think it's T. I don't necessarily think it would be anyone in the Bengals front office. And you could say, oh, well, they want to pay him. That's fine. You can want to pay him. But Joe Burrow can be the guy with enough power that can also do something about it from a cap standpoint, to be able to make that comment after a Monday Night Football game in Week 14 when your team is 5-8 and Tee Higgins has his worst performance of the year, 2 catches on 5 targets, and Joe Burrow talking about how much T matters. There's a lot there, and we do, courtesy of the Bengals, have part of what Joe Burrow had to say about Tee Higgins' future and about how important Tee Higgins is to this offense.
And those discussions are ongoing, and I'm confident that I think we're going to be able to do what it takes to bring T back. And I know that I'm going to do what it takes to get him back, and so is he. We've had those talks, so those are going to be off-season discussions, but I think we're excited about that opportunity.
What gives you that confidence that you'd be able to get Tee Higgins back based off of what's gone on so far?
We'll see. You feel his presence when he's out there. You feel his presence. You feel how it affects the defense. You feel how it affects the defensive coordinator's calls. Even if he's not super productive on a night, teams have to worry about him. You feel his presence. The defense is worried about him, and you feel that.
So not only talking about his confidence and what might need to happen, hinting at what might need to happen to retain Tee Higgins, but also extolling his values and talking about the way he affects the defense. We talked about that in the post-game show as well. From a practical perspective is where it gets interesting, right? And there's all the salary cap gymnastics they'll have to do.
Yep.
They don't really have anyone else to pay this offseason. In fact, we think that they're going to probably be moving on from some veterans on this roster that will free up cap space. So if you're looking ahead and you're looking at over the cap because you're one of those cap nerds and you're looking into the future and you're like, oh, well, how much cap space are the Bengals going to have next year? And right now you see that number says $62.7 million in cap space. And you're thinking, well, they're going to give Jamar Chase certainly some more money, but he's already on the books for a $21 million cap hit with that 5th-year option next year. So an extension could actually lower that number if the Bengals were interested in doing so. And you might be thinking, well, they're going to have to replace BJ Hill and they're going to have to find a safety maybe. They're going to have to find a slot corner. Maybe they need a new guard. So you're thinking about all these positions they have to sign. Sure. But if they cut a couple of guys too, which then they'd have to replace, obviously, that cap number can easily approach $100 million. And that's without touching Joe Burrow's number. And perhaps this is what Joe Burrow is alluding to. You look around the NFL, and these big cap numbers for quarterbacks are often continuously pushed out into the future by the Kansas City Chiefs or the Cleveland Browns or the Buffalo Bills. Teams are very inclined to take these massive base salary years for their quarterbacks. And Joe Burrow's cap number jumps from $29.5 million in 2024 this year to $46.25 million in 2025 next year when that salary takes a big jump. The Bengals could look at that, and Joe Burrow could look at that, and they could revisit that number if they were so inclined. And depending on what kind of extension Tee Higgins is looking for and what kind of extension happens with Jamar Chase, this is where Jamar Chase's playing chess comment comes up. The way they structure these contracts and decide they want these cap hits to land over the next few years can be maneuvered such that with an ever increasing salary cap in the NFL, the Bengals can make it work and field a team around those guys. That's what we've always said. The Bengals have cost themselves money if they choose to do this after this season by not getting these deals done with these receivers earlier. But they can still do it financially.
No doubt. No doubt. The cap space is there. The chance is there. The opportunity is there. And look, Tee Higgins is 25. So he'll be 26 in January. So maybe you sign him for his 26, 27, and 28 years. Maybe he signs a 3-year deal. And the Bengals are comfortable with that. And T is comfortable with that. And Joe wields his power and also restructures what was a team-friendly deal, by the way. It could be pretty darn team-friendly if they want it to be. And so they have that flexibility. And I think it's really hard to paint the picture where I'm more bullish on this offense next season without Tee Higgins, because it's such a drop off. I mean, if Tee Higgins isn't in the picture, Jake, it's Jamar and Andre and who. And so if you can find common ground and get a deal done with Tee Higgins, you just feel so much better. They're always going to be a pass first team. I know Chase Brown is a factor on offense. I'm not belittling him or Andre or the possibility of Eric All, Mike Gesicki if you bring him back. But we know what Tee Higgins does, and Joe does too. And I think that's why he brought it up. And I think that's the most interesting part of this is the timing. Joe Burrow is 28 years old today as we record, Tuesday, December 10th. He's in his 5th NFL season. Up to this point, he has been a quiet guy when it comes to he'll give opinions to Zach or the front office. I don't think he'll shy away from that. But it's usually when he's asked. I think this is all right, I want to keep T, we're keeping T. And now how the organization responds, do they react one way? Do they react another way? Do they just think it's a player backing his guy? I think that's interesting because obviously Joe, and I've said it a few times, has more power than anyone in the building, including ownership. He does. And so I hope they listen, and I think it makes sense for them to listen.
This has come up before. We'll continue the conversation. And Joe Burrow's comments, why it came up, I think is also interesting. It's not like he was asked about that directly. He did bring it up on his own. So we'll finish up with the details of why this is back in the Bengals zeitgeist coming up next.
Today's episode is sponsored by Built Rewards. If you're a renter, listen up. This is a total game changer. Thanks to Built, you can now earn points on rent payments. Just like you do with groceries or travel, paying rent now comes with serious perks, and it's free. That's right, free to join. You earn valuable Built points on your rent for everyday spending at no extra cost. You redeem points for flights, hotel stays, even future rent payments with over 500 airlines, 700,000 hotels in their program. The possibilities are endless. You can access unique experiences that are exclusive to Built members. And whether it's travel, whether it's day-to-day, whether it's using it for your rent, you can start earning points on your rent by paying that you're already paying, by the way. You're paying your rent, so you might as well earn those points by going to joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL. That's joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL. Joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL. BILT. Make sure you use our link so they know we sent you. Joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL.
So how this came up in Joe Burrow's post-game presser is an interesting topic in and of itself. You know, we've talked about what Joe said. We talked about the Jamar Chase point, Tee Higgins' reaction, which is essentially, well, if Joe said it, maybe it is possible. But how this came up was this discussion around what the Bengals stars are playing for. And this is a topic that we've talked about on Locked On Bengals, that we've observed Joe Burrow's comments over the last few weeks. Technically, they're not eliminated from the playoffs. 3% chance, according to models, between 2 and 3% chance to sneak into the playoffs. So technically, that still exists, but nobody's talking about that in the building. We're not talking about that on Locked On Bengals. What Joe and Jamar and have been talking about is this idea of making memories and enjoying playing football together. And in this post game, with the season obviously coming to a conclusion in the near future, these guys are thinking about the fact that they're not necessarily playing a whole lot of football together anymore. And that's how this came up. Is Zach Taylor sent Joe, Jamar, and T out for the coin toss together before the game, which hasn't happened before. And there's a moment there that Joe Burrow talked about. Joe Burrow quoted saying, "I liked that trio. We've played a lot of football together, made a lot of plays, scored a lot of touchdowns, won a lot of games. Us three are some of the best at what we do, and we're great friends and continue to love playing with each other. I realized that in the moment, and that was kind of a moment." I mean, that seems like a big deal to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a big deal, and I also think that it makes Joe start to think of, all right, this season's been hard. How do we get back to championship level? Right. And it's like, all right, well, with T, that's the path. It starts there with us three together. And I get it. I get why he would think that way. I get why he would feel that way. The way this team is built, you lose T and he's just not there. And that's a really tough ask, right? You lose Joe, it's a really tough ask. You lose Jamar. We've seen it over the past few years when one of those guys is out, how much different it is. I wonder why Zach made that decision for that game in that moment. I don't know, but I will say this. We've talked at least there's been a lot of talk. We haven't, but a lot of talk about Zach Taylor's future. Assuming Zach is here next year, you know what? He wants Tee Higgins on the roster. I can promise you that that's the case.
Yeah, they've built their offense around having Tee Higgins and Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. And those guys are the engine that makes the offense go. And with all the other changes that we'll talk about between now and April and May and next year's training camp that will be necessary for this team, those guys are certainly currently foundational pieces. And we've talked a lot on this show, James, about looking around and trying to find foundational pieces and having a hard time finding them, especially when you don't count T. I think that the last thing to talk about here is what practically does Joe Burrow's comments do. And it applies pressure, or as I said yesterday, it either implies pressure or implies that Joe knows something. And I think much, much, much more likely is that this is Joe making a statement in his presser about his preference here, right? And so does that mean anything to the front office? And this is what we will find out in the coming months. We will not get an answer until after the season. The Bengals cannot negotiate an extension with Tee Higgins this year while he's on that franchise tag. They're past the deadline. That was a long, long time ago.
It was July 15th.
But are they willing to do what they need to do from a contract structure perspective? Are they willing to hypothetically restructure Joe's contract? This is not a team that has made significant restructures ever. And that is converting salary to prorated signing bonus money to spread cap hits out, to be very, very specific about what a restructure means. So those are questions that remain to be answered. Last year, Joe Burrow expressed similar confidence that Tee Higgins would be back. And of course, they had the franchise tag in the back pocket, and Joe knew that. So that could be in the back of his mind. But this is obviously a bit of a different scenario. I don't think he's necessarily hinting that the Bengals plan to franchise tag Tee again. But that technically is still an option that we haven't talked about for quite a while.
Well, they should. That's one. They absolutely should. Regardless, they should. It's $26 million. You should. You have the cap space. But the follow up for Joe, and I won't talk to him till Wednesday. Maybe I'll ask, because there's a way to go about it. It's still mid-season. He might not have even gotten this far. But is he willing to go into Mike's office and be like, "Yeah, you got to keep T"? I mean, that's really it, right? Is he willing to look at Mike, Katie, Troy, and be like, "Yeah, you guys, this is, if you need me to restructure, fine, but you have to keep T." Like, it can't just be, if it's just one comment and it's just to us following a Monday Night Football game, as big as it feels right now, a month from now, is that going to matter to the front office? And so 2 months from now, when they're making that franchise tag decision, is that going to matter to the front office? That's where, by the way, maybe they tag him with the hope of landing a long-term deal. I'm not saying tag him and just let him go or trade him or anything like that. But that would be my follow-up. Is Joe willing to continue to push? I don't think he's done that, but that might be required. And by the way, it might be the right thing to do. If you're saying, all right, well, how can the Bengals contend in 2025? It's hard, again, for me to buy into this team being much, much better when you open up another void in the roster and lose Tee Higgins.
Yeah, that's the difficult thing, right? That we've seen this team do for the last few years, is that some of their good players have left and they have struggled to backfill. Not that they will struggle to backfill every player, and sometimes you have to make hard decisions, but they haven't made those hard decisions to keep players in their recent history. And that obviously has showed up this year, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where they've got a lot of youth out there, a lot of new pieces out there, and then some aging players out there, and then none of that is working together. So we'll see how it all shakes out. We'll see how the front office reacts. You're right. I don't think that just this comment is enough, unless this is a persistent thing that Joe continues to bring up for the rest of the season. I think it would require those direct conversations behind the scenes that we won't be privy to. And we won't get answers for a while on that one. And so while it is very much in our awareness today, the idea that answers are imminent is not really out there. This is going to take time. The only thing that could happen between now and the end of the season is they could hypothetically get an extension done with Jamar. Not that there's any indication that they're talking right now, that they've broken their idea of waiting until after the season to get that done again. But that legally, technically, could happen. And that could be a step that they take. That's the only thing that could happen between now and the end of the season. Otherwise, we're waiting until the offseason for these conversations. The Bengals still have some games to play, James. We're talking about a bounce back here late in the season against some bad teams. The Bengals continue to beat up on bad teams. We'll finish the show with a different topic, the Bengals beating up on bad teams in 2024, coming up next.
Hey, Locked On Bengals listeners and viewers, you got to get IceShaker in your life. And if you're watching on YouTube, you see Jake drinking out of his beautiful Cincinnati Bengals IceShaker. Literally, all you got to do is go to IceShaker.com. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at checkout. You'll get 25% off your order. And you have this awesome IceShaker where you can rep the Bengals all the time. They have, and these are awesome. They have a built-in agitator, works as a strainer. So maybe you're thinking, well, tailgates in Nashville, perfect for that. Tailgates at Paycor down the stretch of the season. It's going to be cold. One less thing to carry around. Or maybe you're hitting the gym every single day like Jake Liscow. Well, you can use it for your pre-workout as well. It's created by and used by the Gronkowski brothers. IceShakers has sold over 1 million bottles. They have all the teams you could be looking for: NBA, MLB, NFL, obviously the Cincinnati Bengals. So check them out today and order your Bengals bottles today at IceShaker.com. Use the code LOCKEDONNFL for 25% off your order. That's IceShakers. Show your support for your teams with the best branded workout bottles on the market. IceShakers at IceShaker.com. Promo code LOCKEDONNFL.
The Cincinnati Bengals have beaten up on bad teams in 2024. And one thing that we talked about going into this game and in the last couple of weeks is the idea that the Bengals might bounce back late in the season when they play the Dallas Cowboys, Tennessee Titans, Cleveland Browns, and then they play a couple of playoff contenders for their last two games in the Denver Broncos and Pittsburgh Steelers. And we might see them win a couple of games. Who have the Bengals beaten in 2024? They beat the Carolina Panthers, the New York Giants, the Cleveland Browns, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the Dallas Cowboys. Las Vegas currently is in line for the first pick in the NFL draft. The Giants are in line for the second pick in the NFL draft. The Panthers for the fourth pick in the NFL draft. And the Dallas Cowboys all the way down at 12. I'm missing one team, the Cleveland Browns at 8. The Dallas Cowboys are the first team the Cincinnati Bengals have beaten in 2024 that, if the season were to end today, would be picking after the Bengals in the 2024 NFL draft. They are currently picking, if the season were to end today, the Dallas Cowboys at 12, one pick behind the Cincinnati Bengals, who, if the season were to end today, will be picking 11th in the NFL draft. And that is all we'll talk about, probably too much in this episode, about where the Bengals are drafting in the 2025 NFL draft. But the point stands that the teams they've beaten, James, are teams picking at the very, very top of that draft order. And you're seeing a little bit of that quote unquote dead cat bounce potentially starting this week with the Cowboys win.
Yep. And this is why it's so painful to drop those 3 straight games where they're all by one score. You know, the Baltimore, the Chargers, the Steelers, like, goodness. Like, even if you had gotten one, then it's like, oh, well, then you have the Cowboys and you have the Titans. And then suddenly you could be 6 and 7. And so that's where my mind's gone. I know everyone was thinking draft position and like top 5, top 6. Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase are too good. They just are. They're playing too good. Like, Joe Burrow might be the best quarterback in the NFL this season. It's ridiculous that they're 5 and 8. Jamar Chase is the best receiver in the NFL. It's ridiculous they're 5 and 8, but they are. Trey Hendrickson leads the NFL in sacks. It's a really weird year. And so what you don't want, in this backs up your point, you don't want these long-term decisions to be impacted by some wins down the stretch. You want to remember the feeling of those 3 straight losses where they should have probably won at least 2 of them. And why? Why didn't they finish? Why didn't things go their way? What needs to change? But I also looked at that stretch and I'm like, man, if you win one of those, then the playoff conversation is very different. It just is. If you had beaten Pittsburgh, it feels a lot different right now, even though they haven't really gotten help over the past few weeks. But that's why you got to win games early on. That's why you can't put yourself in an 0-3 hole or 1-4 hole. And yeah, I think they're going to win some games down the stretch. But that doesn't necessarily mean it should impact how the front office views insert whatever player, insert whatever coach. Now, it should impact a lot of guys. And I think over the coming days and weeks, we'll discuss that as far as these players that could earn more playing time, all of those things. But you don't want to say, all right, well, keep Lou because the Cowboys, led by Cooper Rush, couldn't figure out this Bengals defense consistently, right? That's not something, and I'm not saying fire Lou, but I'm certainly not saying that they should be sold on keeping him because of what happened Monday night.
Right. I mean, there's a whole lot of conversation around which coaches to keep and not keep. And recency bias makes it hard for us as humans to keep in mind the 3-game losing streak to start the season, the 3-game losing streak the Bengals just finished with getting this win against the Dallas Cowboys, those 2 losing streaks dooming their season with crazy losses to Baltimore sprinkled in. The 3 crazy losses, the Kansas City 2 Baltimore losses, just absolutely insane the way they lose those games. The Chargers loss, very close to being in that category as well. And you just have these big losing streaks. That's 6 games lost. And including that New England Patriots game to start the season when Joe Burrow wasn't quite himself. I mean, you just can't have those slow starts. You can't have them continuously coming up short in these moments. You can't have the defensive breakdowns and spiral, in the death spiral that we've seen this season where, yeah, Cooper Rush couldn't throw to open receivers effectively in that game. Cooper Rush was pretty bad, but you can't make the mistake that you've made before and be over-influenced by late season games due to recency bias. And I think this has gotten the Bengals before in the Bengals front office, keeping coaches and or players and or units around because of mirage finishes that appear to be, they're building momentum into that's not, they built momentum into next season with Jake Browning last year, right? Winning some of those games. Then they started 0-3. And that's not a thing. I mean, not that one anecdote last season to this season should prove that building momentum into next season isn't a thing, but I think that should be pretty obvious. You're resetting the season all the time when you talk to players. They're like, don't compare this season to last season. This is a new season. We're a different team. And that's true to some degree, right? That's true to a large degree. But when we see the Bengals get some results here, and I think a lot of people have already made up their minds about this, and so that's great. We can't be over-influenced, and the Bengals cannot be over-influenced by late season results against bad teams that, like the Bengals, may not have a whole lot to play for.
Well, yeah, it's Joe Burrow versus Cooper Rush.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you just got to say it out loud. Like this week, Will Levis versus Joe Burrow. Is it going to be shocking if the Bengals beat the Titans? No, they might lose to the Titans. There is a path for that, but it's not going to shock anyone if they beat the Titans. Does that mean that they're close to winning the division? Does that mean they're close to getting back to the playoffs? It's just 2 separate things. And you're right. In the Bengals' history, these down the stretch surges have changed things. And we'll see. I think expectations, I mean, we spent 20 minutes talking about Tee Higgins, and it felt like that was, and we should have, but it felt like that door was closed. I don't think this is your 90s Bengals anymore, even though a lot of people default back to there anytime it struggles, in this organization struggles. Now, are they completely modernized? No. But hopefully they understand that it's not as simple as, oh my God, Andy Dalton found Tyler Boyd. Marvin in the Bengals finished strong. We should bring him back next year. Like, talking about that Ravens finale from 2017. Like, it isn't that simple either. And so hopefully they understand that.
Yeah, totally agreed there. That's going to do it, though, for this episode, James. We're on a short week.
We are. Short weeks, baby. Let's go.
It's Tuesday as we record this episode. This is usually when we record on Monday, which means we're already to a crossover tomorrow. We're already looking ahead to that Tennessee Titans game, the Brian Cali coaching his team against the Cincinnati Bengals down in Tennessee, where the Bengals seem to play every year. and are playing again this year. Played the Titans a lot lately.
Yeah.
They hosted them in
I know.
2020. I was just looking back through some previous years, but
It's a lot of Nashville trips.
A
A
lot.
lot of Nashville. And it's
Yeah.
cold. I don't want to deal with the cold, but yeah.
No.
Guess I'll walk my happy butt on Broadway all cold. Guess I will.
No one tell Ben Baby about this part of the show. That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Back tomorrow with the crossover. Thanks for listening.
Grace.
Hoo day, and have a good one.